Hello, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started now with the lesson. So this week we're talking about the Tower of Babel, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that story. And the title of the lesson will be "How Do You Become Great?" So we'll kind of see that through an example of how the original Babylonians, the people of Babel, try to become great. But before we do that, we're going to look at some key themes of Genesis that we've seen so far. Because in Genesis as a book, you start seeing a lot of patterns, a lot of the same things happening. We're like, oh wait, I feel like I remember that from a few chapters ago. And you start to see that in the story of Babel as well. And so we'll cover those key themes by way of review. First question, what function and identity was man given? What function and identity was man given? So this goes back to our lesson on who are you. Anybody remember what our identity is? Do you remember? Yes.
Well, we're made in God's image. We're God's people.
Yep, made in his image. That's sort of a very foundational element for our identity. And do you remember what task we were given? What task humankind was given, Caleb?
Having dominion.
Yep, having dominion. So God created man in his image, and we talked a little bit about what that meant. It means that we're God's representatives, just like a king would send his bust, his image throughout the land to represent him. We are created as God's image, his representatives on earth. And a big part of what that means is to take dominion and to spread God's glory throughout the world. And so we represent God. That's our position. And because of that, we're to take dominion and subdue the earth. And so in that lesson, we talked a little bit about what that means, about the value of work, of building, creating. We can do that because God made us to be like him. And to represent God well, we have to align with his purposes, what he's doing in history. And to be good representatives, we also have to resemble God. We have to look something like him. And so we have certain capacities, including moral capacity, the ability to choose right and wrong. And those things are unique to man. Animals do not have that. And we can also be in a relationship with God because of this. And ultimately, our purpose is to reflect God's glory. So we should be holy as God is holy. We should reflect his character, and we should worship him. We should ascribe him worth, praise, value. And in our decisions, it should show that we value God above other things. And so we're made in the image of God. And here's a question. Why did mankind fall into sin? Why did mankind fall into sin? Zach, what do you think? Okay, that's true. That's why we sin right now. What about, so thinking back to Adam and Eve, why did Adam and Eve first sin? Because they weren't born with that sinful nature.
Because they were tempted.
Okay, they were tempted by the serpent. And do you remember anything else why they were, Luke?
Well, Adam and Eve wanted to be like God.
Right. That was a big part of it. They wanted that independence. So man rebelled, they sinned. But it was as and because Eve especially, but Adam and Eve were seeking independence from God. They were making decisions on their own. And so you see that in the verse where it talks about Eve sinning, it doesn't say then the woman believed the serpent, so she ate. It says then the woman saw. She observed something and came to certain conclusions on her own. So she saw that the tree was good for food. She made a value judgment. Like this looks pretty good. It looks tasty. And that it was a delight to the eyes. It was beautiful. And that the tree was desirable to make one wise. So there you start seeing that pride and desire to elevate oneself in wisdom, in worldly wisdom. So she took from its fruit and ate, and she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. And so her sin, it wasn't because she was trusting the serpent. The serpent certainly pushed her in that direction and deceived her in a sense. But Eve was trusting in her own senses, her own opinion, at that point, her own experience, her own view of the world. She was just making decisions for herself, making value judgments for herself versus trusting in the sufficiency of God's word. And so she sought independence from God. Instead of depending on him for wisdom, she made her own decisions. And ultimately, we see that pride is at the root of sin, and it deceives us. So Eve ultimately was deceived by her own heart and her own pride. And then how does God deal with sin and its spread? How does God deal with sin and its spread? Jace, what do you think?
He cursed it.
Yeah, so he cursed Adam and Eve. So there's judgment there, right? He judges. There's another thing you often see, though, especially in Genesis. So with judgment comes something else. What else comes often alongside that judgment? And you see that in the curses as well. You remember, Luke?
The decay of the human world.
Okay, so that judgment has consequences. Is it just pure judgment consequences bad that comes out of the curse in Genesis 3 and elsewhere in Genesis? So what we also see is mercy. So throughout Genesis, you see God judging sin and yet providing hope and mercy through that judgment. So there's often this theme that you see in Genesis and elsewhere in the Bible of salvation through judgment. So let's look at some examples of God providing hope and mercy in the midst of judgment. So Genesis 3, what hope was given there? What hope was given in Genesis 3? Yeah.
God promised after the fall that he would send a savior.
Yeah, so there's a seed that was going to crush the serpent's head and have final victory. So there's the curse, yet hope of a promised seed, and that theme gets picked up throughout the rest of Genesis and the Bible. What about Genesis 4, so the story of Cain and Abel? What's the judgment and also mercy that you see there?
God gave Cain a lot of times a lot of opportunities to repent and confess.
Okay, great. Yeah, so he gave him opportunities to change. He didn't, and so he ultimately was cursed with banishment. And yet there's mercy, right? He didn't get what he deserved. He wasn't killed. God actually, in certain ways, protected Cain, despite him being a wicked person and murdering. And then Genesis 6 through 9. So what's the judgment there? It's the flood, obviously. But what was a mercy that we saw as well?
The mercy to Noah and his family.
Yeah, so there's mercy to a remnant that was saved. And then what about after the flood? What else? What other mercy do you see?
The rainbow, the promise that there would be no more global flood.
Yep, so he gives them a covenant with man so that he wouldn't judge the world again in a flood. So there's a flood. There's certainly judgment on sin. Yet God saved a remnant, a small group of people to be his people and to restart. And they were given covenant grace. And so the key themes we see that man was created to be God's royal image, to represent him in the world, to do things for his glory. Yet man sought independence, sought autonomy, and tried to become like God and be their own God, make their own decisions. And so God judges this sin and yet provides hope and mercy. And we see that this all wasn't by accident. It's all working towards God's sovereign plan with what he wants to do in history. So we'll see a lot of these things come to a head in the story of Babel. So we don't have too much time to get into chapter 10, but we'll show a little bit of the context before the Tower of Babel. So we see in Genesis 9:1, God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. What does that remind you of? So this is Genesis 9. It says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. What are you immediately reminded of when you're reading that?
Back to when God first created all the creatures and said, "Be fruitful and multiply."
Right, exactly. So this is kind of coming right off of that dominion mandate, and it's restated here. So the people were supposed to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. How do you do that practically? How are they to do that? What should that have looked like? If I told you, hey, there's this barren land, there's this desert, I want you to go there, be fruitful, multiply, and fill up the desert. How would you do that?
They would spread out.
Okay, you'd spread out, and how do you get more people? You start a family, right? You start a family, you have kids, you spread out, and that's what was supposed to happen in Genesis 10 after the flood. They were supposed to spread out in the earth. Now, does that sound like fun to you? Would you enjoy that, you think? Maybe it sounds like an adventure. This was quite a wild world, though, right? It probably wouldn't have been fun and easy to actually do that. But we see in Genesis 10, there's a genealogy, and it's talking about what's called the Table of Nations often, and it's showing how the nations and the people spread out, they dispersed, they created these people groups and these nations, and it's repeated 3 times, something along the lines of according to their families. So with the people, families were developed, and those became the nations and the people groups. According to their tongues, their languages, what they spoke, so they all had different languages. By their land, so there's that, to have a nation, you need a geography, and by their nations. So we see that it appears in Genesis 10 that things are going as God commanded. And even here, you see, according to their tongues, all these different nations had different languages. What sort of, when you hear that, you might think, wait, something seems a little off here. How did that happen, according to their tongues, their languages?
They all found different ways how to communicate.
Okay. So what's interesting is in Genesis 10, you see this dispersion of the nations, and it appears that people are obeying God. But then you come to Genesis 11, and you actually get the explanation for how that happened, how those nations dispersed. And what you realize is actually man wasn't obeying God. They were all joined together. They were staying in one place. And God had to judge them and confuse their languages, create multiple languages for them to actually spread out. So in Genesis 10, you sort of see the history of the world and the creation of nations. And then in Genesis 11, you get an explanation for how that actually comes about, and how the nations actually went and dispersed. You do start seeing some clues and some hints of rebellion, though, in Genesis 10. So it takes sort of a little bit of an excursus to talk about Nimrod. So I'll read about Nimrod from Genesis 10 here. Now Cush was the father of Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one on earth. He was a mighty hunter before Yahweh. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before Yahweh. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. The land of Shinar, by the way, is the land of Babylon. That's where Babylon was. From that land, he went out to Assyria and built Nineveh and Rehoboth and Calah. Any names there? What names sound familiar to you in this list? Assyria and Nineveh, yeah. So those come up later in the Bible. And actually, a lot of Genesis 10, you see different people groups and nations that the people of Israel would know about. So it's kind of explaining how those nations came about. And notice, what did Nimrod do? What did he build?
Kingdoms.
He built kingdoms, yep. And what kingdom in particular is mentioned that's of note? Yeah, Babel, right? So Babel and these other cities that would have been in where the place of Babylon. And so, people, there's a lot of different debate and speculation exactly Nimrod's role, but it seems fairly likely that he was actually the original founder of the Tower of Babel. He was the original leader. He built this kingdom, this one world government and nation, essentially, that founded the city of Babel. And it says there that he was a mighty hunter, so he's a very impressive person. Some people, again, speculate that. I mean, what's probably the most impressive animal you could have hunted sometime after the flood?
Lions.
Yeah, actually, there's something else. Dinosaurs, yeah. So some people speculate that he was actually a hunter of dinosaurs. But ultimately, he was a very impressive person that was able to bring people around him and build build these kingdoms. Is that a good thing or a bad thing, do you think? What he was doing, building kingdoms. Is that good or bad? What do you think, Wyatt?
Well, probably in a sense it's good because they're creating kingdoms. But if it's a one kingdom and they're all concentrated, that would be disobeying God.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so you start seeing this sense that maybe people aren't going the way that they're supposed to. And then that brings us into the story of the Tower of Babel. So we'll dig into that. Genesis 11:1. Now the whole earth had the same language and the same words, and it happened as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. So do you see any rebellion here? Luke?
They settled. They didn't keep spreading.
Yeah, they didn't keep spreading, right? They weren't following God's command. And there's also, you get this hint in the fact that they journeyed east. So there's this motif, there's this theme, this pattern you see in Genesis where those who rebel against God go east. So when Adam and Eve were sent out of the garden, they were sent east. When Cain was banished, he went east. When there was that choice where Abraham had to choose the west side of the lot or the east side, he chose the east. There's this common and there's more examples of this where people went east. So you start seeing this people that they're not going in the direction where blessing typically comes, and they're going east and they're settling there. This isn't good. Again, Babel, it's a Hebrew word for Babylon, which is in the land of Shinar. So this is the story of Babylon. Babylon has a very rich history in the Bible and even outside of the Bible. It's a very mighty kingdom. And in the Bible, it's a kingdom where many false religions come from. It's a kingdom that is in rebellion to God. It's known for its arrogance and pride. Babylon has a very rich history, and you see the start of this history in Genesis 11. So, verse 3. Then they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone, and they had tar for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower." So one thing that's of note to start is they were innovators. They didn't use the typical building material, which would have been stone and mortar, and that's what the Israelites would have used whenever they built anything. But they invented new ways of building, and this is pretty impressive, especially back then. When it says they let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly, there's a lot of wordplay. If you could see the Hebrew and read the Hebrew, a lot of interesting things going on. But it's saying there, let's brick bricks and burn them burningly, essentially. And these are new building materials that were very flexible and were common, especially in the land of Babylon. So they were innovators. They came up with new ways of doing things. They were impressive. And they used brick and tar instead of mortar. Some people speculate that they were using this because it was waterproof and that they were essentially trying to waterproof the tower from another flood. Because they should have been familiar with the flood story. A good chance that Noah and his sons were actually still alive during the time of the Tower of Babel, because they lived 400 years after the flood. So there was a city and a tower. And again, it's kind of terse in the language. It's possible that they're saying a city tower, and you've maybe seen some depictions of this where there's like this large tower that's going up, and that tower was actually the city. So that's possible. It's also possible there was a city and a tower separately. But whatever it was a very impressive human endeavor, especially when this was sort of the first great feat of human architecture. And the tower was certainly a centerpiece. Their goal was to get high up into the heavens. And we start to see, especially in verse 4, their rebellion, more about the rebellion. And you start seeing things that are common in rebellion, not just with the people of Babel, but throughout all history. And they said, Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth. So first thing we'll highlight is the rebellion of human pride. And we see this when it says, let us make for ourselves a name. What does that mean? What does it mean to make a name? What do you think that means? Are you going to raise your hand, Wyatt?
Like, oh, I lost the word. Yeah, I forgot the word.
Okay. Can you think of another word?
No.
Okay. Well, if you think of it, no. Yes, Caleb.
They want to be famous.
Famous. Yeah, I think famous is a good word.
They want to be feared by everyone.
Feared and powerful. Yeah, that's true. Like there's a lot of. We'll see this a little bit later, but building a city like this, it was a sign of strength and security.
Who would they be feared by if they just one big group?
That's a good question. So that's where the word I like is to build a reputation or legacy. I was originally thinking something more along the lines of famous, but it's sort of like famous to who. I think kind of what they were trying to achieve was this great legacy that they would be well known for something, for building this great tower, and actually for reaching into the heavens. So they wanted to build a legacy for themselves. What does that term legacy mean?
Legend.
A legend? Okay, so like legendary, kind of. And why is it appealing? Well, it's appealing because of our pride, right? So a legacy is something where you leave behind you something great that you're remembered for. It's being remembered. It's having that reputation, being put into the history books. Ironically, they were put into the history books, the greatest history book, but for not quite the reason they were hoping for. So they were very prideful. They wanted to make this name for themselves, this legacy, this thing they would leave behind that they would forever be famous about. And we see others seeking a legacy in Genesis, and it's generally not seen as being a very good thing. So Genesis 6:4, earlier, there's the mighty men of old, the men of renown. They were famous as well. They had a legacy in a sense. Even Cain, and actually Cain, you see a lot of similar patterns. What Cain did was almost like a prototype. It set up a pattern for what Babel does. They did a lot of the same things, including building a city. And Cain, he named the city after the name of his son. Oftentimes people see their kids as a source of their legacy. So I say it's not typically a good thing. Why is legacy, why might not that be a good thing to pursue?
Because it can be a bad legacy.
It could be a bad legacy, right? And ultimately, seeking a legacy is seeking what only belongs to God. God is the one that we should be seeking to build a name for, a reputation for. We're not seeking to build something for our own benefit, for our own glory. So by seeking a legacy, you're seeking what belongs to God alone. And remember, we're God's images. So we're made in the image of God. Our goal should be to reflect God's glory, not to bring glory to ourselves. And this is what the people of Babel were doing. They wanted to build this glorious name for themselves. So we have the rebellion of human pride. And we see another rebellion here, the rebellion of human achievement. And they said, come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. So this is a very impressive tower. And it reflected their greatness to the world. And people still today are tempted and do many things because God's given us lots of capacities. He's given us lots of ability to build, to achieve. He's given people innately often an ambition to go out and do something. And man uses those capacities and that drive to build things that show their glory. Right?
Also, in the last few words of that verse, to say lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth, we're probably afraid of that because then they'd be weaker.
Right. No, so that's a good contrast. So they're trying to build this name for themselves, and the lest we be scattered shows what their fear was. And that's actually, I think that's our next slide, or 2 slides from now. So that's a good thing to notice. So let me ask this question. Is it right or is it wrong to be ambitious? And do you kind of know what ambitious means? Maybe we'll start there. What does it mean to be ambitious? Luke?
To seek something greater, to make a name of yourself.
Yeah, so it's sort of this drive and desire to achieve something, to do something. So is that right or wrong? Right.
It can be right or wrong. If you were ambitious to like spread the Bible or something like that, then it would be all right. And then if you were ambitious to just like disobey God, it would be bad.
Yep, that's exactly right. So we actually see this, even Paul used this word of ambition for exactly what you're describing there. And this way I make it my ambition to proclaim the gospel, not where Christ was already named. So you saw there, the different apostles had different ambitions, you could say, different goals. Some were more focused on serving and preaching the gospel to the Jews. Paul had a little bit of a unique role where he was very focused and passionate about spreading the gospel to the Gentiles, to people that didn't know about Yahweh, didn't know about the Messiah. So that's where his desire was to go and talk about the Messiah where he wasn't already named. He was named in the Jewish communities, although they didn't recognize him to be Jesus. So this was their Paul's ambition. And so here's a quote from John Piper. He has a great sermon on this passage and this idea, what he calls a holy ambition. So here's a quote from John Piper. Mom and dad, single people, young and old, everyone should have a holy ambition, something you really, really want to do for the glory of God. So that's a good thing. In this day and age, there's many things that sort of like try to tamp down or kill people's drive. Like people don't have as much of that drive, but having that drive, the desire to do things, God's given you that, but you have to use it for the right purposes, and it's a good thing. But what happens is sin twists man's capacities and desires and ambitions, and it twists the dominion mandate to where instead of doing it for God's purposes and his glories and things he wants, it's using it for selfish gain. But we should instead, and we saw that with the dominion mandate, right? Like hard work is a good thing, and it's something that we should be engaged in. And going back to the image of God, God is giving you many great gifts and capabilities. And there's 3 options for how you will use these God-given capacities. So one is you could squander and neglect your gifts, just decide not to use them at all. Or you could use them for selfish and worldly purposes. And so unbelievers, these are the 2 things that happen. Either you're neglecting it, you're lazy, you don't do anything with those gifts, or you could use them and do great things like the people of Babel, but great things in the world's eyes. But what we want instead is to tie everything back to doing everything for the glory of God and to achieve God's purposes. So we see the rebellion of human achievement, that the people of Babel were using God's good gifts for evil purposes, for self-glorification. And next we'll see the rebellion of human security. So, and we see this in a couple of places. So the lest we be scattered, and also the fact that they were building a city in the first place. So when you think of a city, what do you think of? What might happen in a city?
Lots of merchants, trading,
Okay, lots of activity. Yeah,
an army, probably,
an army.
government.
So if you let's say you're starting a family, and you're like, one of the things we want as a family, we want to live someplace that's safe. We want to live someplace that's safe. Would you go to the city or would you go to the country? The country. Was that? Yeah, right? So our sense of city, like there's a lot of crime, and it's true. Do you think that was the same sense they had back then? Was the city a dangerous place? I mean, maybe there's some things that are dangerous, especially a big city. But actually a city was was sort of this place of security. So you imagine, like, you have the people in the countryside in the fields, an army comes to attack, everyone flees into the city. And so they had much different feelings about it. The city was a place of security and protection. That's where you go for safety. And of course, this is rebellion. They don't want to be scattered. They don't want to actually fulfill God's mandate because of their fear. And they feared becoming a nomadic people, a people that sort of spread out and really go into the unknown. And instead, they built a city. And cities, again, represent strength and safety. They wanted that. And also, this really ties back to Cain. Cain was, when he was cursed, God told him, you're going to be a wanderer and a vagrant. And Cain was like, that's too great. I'm worried I'm going to get killed. He was afraid of being nomadic and a wanderer. And then what he did right after that, so God's saying you're going to be a wanderer and a vagrant, it says he settled. And he settled in the east, just like the Tower of Babel, and he built a city. So Cain did exactly what the people of Babel did because of his fear. And all of us have that same temptation, is to make an idol out of security and comfort. So obviously safety isn't necessarily a bad thing. Stability isn't necessarily a bad thing. If you have a family, those are things you want to seek out. But it can be possible for it to become an idol where the fear of losing that is greater than your fear of God. And so we should instead fear God first and foremost and trust him. But people seek this today. They seek financial security. Have you heard that term before? Financial security, financial stability. It's like, if I could just make enough money, then I don't have to worry about things. If I could just get to this, if I could just get that promotion, then I don't have to worry about things. Health security. If I could just not have to worry about disease or sickness, then I'll feel safe. I'll feel comfortable. And then there's also a sort of a social and reputational security. If people just think well of me, if I just am able to keep together my social situation. So that's probably something that's especially tempting as teens. So security in who like your friend group, essentially. So these are all things that can become an idol. And it was an idol for the people. They were scared of being scattered, and they sought their sense of security and comfort in a city instead of in God. And then we have the rebellion of human religiosity. Human religiosity. What do you think I mean by religiosity? What kind of comes to mind? Maybe if anything comes to mind by that.
Religious animosity.
Animosity? Oh, so like hating religion? Or so that you have that isity at the end, but it's probably different than that. It's more what I mean by the sense of, like, again, finding security in doing religious things, building your own religion. So why are they reaching into heaven? So what do you think their goal was? So they're trying to reach into heaven. What were they trying to achieve with that?
To be like God.
Okay, so I do think that in their minds, as they got closer to heaven, they would become more godlike. But what's another reason, especially think these pagan cultures, what are they trying to achieve by getting into heaven?
Well, I think they've probably known that heaven, you live forever, so they probably want to live forever.
Yeah, I think it's something along those lines. So some people speculate, they were mad at Yahweh for sending the flood. They're going to go up there and try to kill him. Some people speculate that they just did it to be like, look what we did. Now we're equal with God. And there's a sense of them trying to be more like God, but I don't think that's really the heart of it, especially in the context that this was written. I think what they wanted to access to the gods. And in fact, the term Babel, what that means is the gate of the gods, the gateway to heaven, in a sense. And so they were trying to reach into heaven because they wanted to get access to the gods. And that was a chief way that they would, again, going back to pride, that they would have this sense of pride and this legacy was we're the ones that got to heaven and became and our tower became the gateway to heaven and to the gods. And I think we kind of get this sense even today that the higher in the sky you get, the higher up you get, the closer you are to God. So in fact, many people, many false religions would worship on mountains. And you even think about Israel, where they did false worship, it was in the high places. So they thought the higher we got up, the closer we are to God. And people sometimes even, and I think this is sort of a false notion, but they talk about mountaintop experiences. I'm going to go into the mountain, I'm going to get up high, and I'm going to feel closer to God. So that's not a feeling that is valid in Christianity, but it's a feeling that really has been there throughout all history, and the pagans even felt that way. And so they would have this sense of, if I can just get higher, I'll be closer to God.
It's kind of denying God's omnipresence.
It's true. That's true. Yep. And kind of on that point, like about mountaintop experiences, where do we experience God? How do we get closer to God? Where do we go?
In prayer.
Okay, in prayer. Yep. So we could talk to God in prayer. We have direct access to Him. We don't need to go to a mountaintop. What else? Where else do we encounter God? One of the girls need to answer. Aya?
At church.
Okay. Why at church?
Because you can worship and, like, sing.
Okay, yeah, because at church is where we worship and we can praise Him. What else happens at church? That can be Zach. Yeah, His Word, right? So I think that's in His Word we learn about Him. In prayer we can communicate with Him. We get closer to God by being in a relationship with Him, right? Not by seeking a mountaintop experience. And what do you do when you don't have a mountain? Because remember, it actually said they found a plain. So they're on a plain. There weren't any mountains nearby, so you have to build your own mountain. And this is actually a very common thing. So people often connect the Tower of Babel to ziggurats, which were very famous in Babylon. They probably started these. I don't necessarily think this is what the Tower of Babel looked like, but they were trying to achieve very similar things. So these ziggurats were these essentially temples, and you could see at the top there would often be an altar to a false religion, to another god. And so they thought, like, we'll get higher, we'll build the highest structure, and then we'll have this altar and we'll worship God at the top. And so, especially in that context, when it's talking about building a tower reaching into the heavens, it would have immediately brought to mind these examples of ziggurats and how they thought that they could get closer to God, and they were a source of worshiping God. And Babylon, it's known for many false gods, many false religions developed from the people of Babylon. So in some way, in the Tower of Babel, they were forming some sort of false religion. Don't know exactly what that was, but it had a lot of religious significance, what they were doing. And they ultimately didn't recognize the creator-creature distinction. So that's like what you're saying before about becoming like God. And this is true in any false religion, any false view of God, is you start making man more like God, and you start making God more like man. And so if you think that you can get closer to God by being higher up, like, you have a complete misunderstanding about who God is. And you have a complete misunderstanding about who you are, and that you are capable of doing that just by getting higher up. So they didn't realize that, like, the Creator is completely separate from them. He doesn't dwell in this physical dwelling place in the sky. He doesn't have a body. They had a very poor understanding of who the true God was. And by them trying to do this, they had too high a view of man and our own ability to achieve things. And of course, all false religions start this way. They're all invented by man. Christianity is very unique compared to many of the false religions out there. Can you think of what are some of the unique things about Christianity compared to other false religions?
You actually have a personal relationship with God.
Okay, there's a personal relationship. And in false religions, how do you become saved or better or closer to God? How does that happen? Aya?
Like, sometimes it's through works.
Yeah, it's pretty much always through works. So it's and of course with men, if they're creating their own religion, then they're going to give themselves something to do that makes them feel better about themselves. Christianity is unique in that it's by grace. It's because of what God has done, not because of what we have done. And so here they were, again, had wrong ideas, creating their own ideas of how to worship. So that in the Tower of Babel, we see the rebellion of human religiosity, creation of human religion. And then we also see the rebellion of human independence. And when they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth." So you see this, let us, lest we. So there's this sense of community. They're doing this together, but they were achieving something on their own. They're achieving something independent and apart from God. And ironically, when people do that, when people tout their independence, they're often doing it in a community group at the same time. But what does that mean? What does it mean to be independent and autonomous? What do you think that means, Ivan?
Well, to be like separate or
Okay.
different.
Yeah. So separate's a great word. So separate from who?
God.
Yeah, right. So trying to do it apart from God on their own. And so there's a sense of self-governing. The sense of like, I get to decide for myself what's true and right and best for me. Nobody can control me or tell me what to do. So especially as as teenagers, you start getting this sense of independence, this desire for it, in the sense that you know best, you know what's better. Who actually knows what's best for you? Okay, God's a good answer. One other good answer. Caleb?
Your parents.
Your parents, yep, right. Your parents actually know much better than you what's best for you, what's true and right. And hopefully they're teaching you to own those things on your own, for sure. But that desire for independence and to sort of leave your parents' direction, and again, ironically, you sort of do that often with friends, and you can get this sense that like the friends sort of like can bolster you up in that way. And the sense that you don't want to be controlled, you don't want to be told what to do anymore, right? And that same desire, those same heart desires are the same things that were in the people of Babel. And there's this self-reliance. I can do it myself and don't need help from others. You see this even, I have a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, right? They start getting the sense of like, some of them at least, one of them didn't really have this, but most of the others had this sense of like, I want to do it myself. I don't need help from others. And on the one hand, you want to sort of encourage that. You want them to be independent, right? So like at some point, if you get married, it says to leave and cleave, right? You have to leave your parents and start an independent family unit. But in another sense, you should always see yourself as dependent on God. But this desire for self-reliance, I can do it myself, I don't need help, I can make my own decisions, that is a prideful heart, the same as the people in Babel. And then self-defining. I get to choose my own identity. I get to be my own person. I get to decide what my purpose in life is. And then Isaiah 53:6. All of us like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way. That's the heart of it, is going your own way, not God's way. And of course, does anybody know what the rest of the verse says here? It says, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. So God, part of what happened at the cross, or what did happen at the cross, was all of our sin, all of our desire for independence, all of our rebellion against God was put on Christ. And the Father treated Christ as if he was like the people of Babel that was rebellious. because we've gone our own way. We're like sheep, and sheep are easily directed. And again, it's a fascinating thing. People that view themselves as being very independent, they tend to be very influenced by others, very influenced by friends. As adults, it can be very influenced by media and content that we consume. You could be very influenced by music. There's many things you can be very influenced by, and ironically, those things will often be touting that you should be independent and autonomous and self-governing. And then in verse 5, we start seeing a reversal. So then Yahweh came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men have built. So verses 1 through 4, you have this come let us. You see the man's actions, mankind, what they're doing, what they're building. And then verses 5 through 8, we see God undoing everything that man was doing. And ironically, ironically, God has to come down to see their puny tower. So they thought they were building this great thing. And God does see it, but he has to come down. He has to condescend because he is the creator. And God's not ignorant of mankind's sin. He sees it, right? He saw it with the flood and judged. And then you notice here it says sons of men. So it's just emphasizing they're just mere men. They're creatures. Here's a quote from one of the commentators I like. The necessary descent of God and the humanness of the enterprise that the men were building shows the escapade for what it was, a tiny tower conceived by a puny plan and attempted by a pint-sized people. So, you know, there might be many things like, maybe you see a person or a building or just some great thing mankind is doing, and you might be impressed by it. But in the end, none of it is impressive, not in God's eyes, at least. And shouldn't be, in a sense, in a Christian's eyes. And so, verse 6, we start to see God's concern. And Yahweh said, behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language, and this is what they have begun to do. So now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. So one people. So man, there's this unity, and it resulted in this concentration of sin. What should this remind you of that we just learned about? Seeing man unified in sin and rebellion. What should that remind you of?
When they put Jesus to death, they were all unified against him.
Okay, that's true. So you see this pattern over and over, and it's going to be worked out throughout the rest of history moving forward. And then what about looking back through what we've seen already in Genesis? What does it remind you of? Mankind's unity in rebellion against God. Anything reminds you of, Caleb?
The flood.
Yeah, I think the flood, right? So man was united in rebellion against God there as well. And then what happens when man's sin gets out of control? What does God do? He judges, right? And so I think what it says, there's a fair bit of irony and sarcasm here probably when it says now nothing they purpose to do will be impossible for them. There's some degree an ironic statement. But there is some truth in terms of, if they keep going in this route, they're going to create the same environment which required a flood for the people to be wiped out. And so God, therefore, takes action. And this is all part of God's sovereign plan, what man did and how God is responding to it. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's language. So Yahweh scattered from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. So there's a judgment. And that judgment is by confusing their language. Remember, they had one language, and this is where God confuses it to where now there's multiple languages that they're speaking so that they can't work together. And if you've ever worked on, think about even our work days, right? You're working as a team. Imagine if you couldn't talk to each other. Imagine if you couldn't hear instructions from someone helping you, right? You wouldn't get a whole lot of work done, right? So by confusing their language, it stopped their ability to build this city and tower. Matthew 23, whoever exalts himself shall be humbled. So you see God undoing this great work man was trying to do. But how could this also be a mercy? How could this be a mercy as well? What do you think, Luke? Sure. And he's promised not to do that, right? But part of how God keeps his promises is through means and through controlling history. And so it was a mercy because it caused the people to actually obey God's command to scatter and fill the earth. And you see this principle throughout the Bible, that God constrains sin and sinners so that we aren't as wicked as we possibly can be. So like each of you aren't as wicked as you possibly could be especially if you're an unbeliever, partly because of the environment you're in and that God's given you Christian parents. And so that means that in many ways your sin will be constrained, right? God, through this judgment, he created the nations were formed, and nations and governments are a constraint on sin because, like in our government, right, we have law enforcement, we have judges, there's law and order that constrains man's wickedness. And so this confusion of the language, so that man couldn't be unified together in a one world government, is a blessing, and it constrains sin. And from here, we see the creation of all the different languages. So the languages form in these nations. And then, so let me ask you this. Do you think people spoke English after the Tower of Babel? What do you think, Alina? Do you think they spoke English? You don't? Okay. Anybody have any? Yes. What?
I mean, probably not the kind of English you use now, but probably more a different way to speak English, like old time English.
Well, English is combined with like a bunch of different languages. So
Yeah.
probably not.
Yeah. So there was this formation of different original languages, and then those languages evolved and changed over time. So you see this there. So the formation of the languages, going back to chapter 10, these are the families of the sons of Noah according to their generations by their nations, and out of these nations they were separated on the earth after the flood. So that was because of the confusion of languages. And he made from one man, and this is in Acts, he made from one man every nation of mankind to inhabit all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times when they would be around. God decided, like every kingdom, every nation, when they would thrive, when they would fall, and the boundaries of their inhabitation. So this is all God's doing. And part of how he did this was through the different languages. And from those languages, many languages sort of evolved and branched off. So have you ever seen like a family tree where you start up here and then there's kids and then they have kids? That's kind of what happens with languages as well, as they branch off. And so an example of this is Spanish, French, and Italian. Spanish wasn't around at the Tower of Babel. It actually emerged from Latin. And so Spanish, French, and Italian, they have a lot of similarities because they all came from the language of Latin, which nobody speaks today, but we have a lot of written documents on Latin. And those are called the Romance languages. And so I'll give you, we'll go through a quick example of how these languages evolve over time with the English language. So we start out with Old English, which was spoken by the Anglo-Saxons. So these were Germanic tribes that migrated to Great Britain. So actually, let me ask you this. What language do you think English is mainly from?
Well, there's a whole lot of French.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of Latin. I mean, it just kind of comes from everywhere.
So-
including Old English.
Right. So French and Latin, that's true. That's typically what I would have thought of as like we evolved from Latin, some of the Romance languages, because we have a lot of vocabulary from there. But actually, the base of the English language is Germanic. It works much more like German, and a lot of our frequently used vocabulary is more German and Germanic than it is Latin. And so the reason for that was it started with these Germanic tribes that migrated to Great Britain who spoke Old English. So here's a quote from Beowulf. And there's actually one. Does anybody here speak Old English or can read it? No, there's actually one person here who can, and that's, I think, Forrest. So Forrest, can you put you on the spot? Can you sound this out?
Yeah, so. This is the opening lines of Babel. So, when garden and your dogum.
Do you have any idea what that means?
So it's like, something about the Danes, the spear Danes, something along
Okay.
those lines.
Yep. Yeah. So here's the translation. Listen, we've the spirit of Danes in the days of yore. So you said that's the opening line of Beowulf? Yep. So that was Old English, very Germanic. Yeah. You probably couldn't read that or understand that, right? But then we have Middle English, and it's funny you mentioned French. So Middle English developed when the Normans and kind of came in and conquered, and they mixed French with Old English. And it's not maybe modern day French, an older version of French. But that's how Middle English developed, and that's where we get some of those Latin roots and a lot of those French words. And so here's a book from that time period. Canterbury tells, Juan that April with his showers shoot. Do you recognize any words there? Any guesses of any words there?
That with his.
Yeah. So yep. So and those are I think some common words that we use every day, and they're more the German side. What about April? What do you think of when you hear that? I don't know. I have no idea if I'm saying it right, but
The month.
the month of April. Yeah. And Juan, what could that mean? What's it mean? What? What else? When? Yeah, that's yep. So here's a translation: when April with its sweet showers. So you kind of see that there, showers, suit. Again, I don't know if I'm saying it how they would have said it, but this is a lot more familiar, right? So because of this mixing with French, we get something a little bit more familiar, and then early modern English. So think Shakespeare. This kind of came about because of the printing press. So the printing press, as it started printing books, things started getting more stable and solidified. And then you had the Renaissance, and in the Renaissance, they added a lot more words from Latin and such. And so that's where, like, I don't know if I remember as a kid, I had these like Latin roots that you would learn, and you see all these other words. So we have a lot of words from Latin and Greek, but they were added. A lot of them were added during this Renaissance period, which is why our more frequent words are more Germanic, but like 80% of our vocabulary is elsewhere, but the core frequent ones are more German. And so Shakespeare, O Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? So I don't have a translation for this because you kind of know what that means, right? Nobody really speaks this way anymore, but you start seeing and understanding what it means. And then you have modern English, which is standardized by dictionaries and the empire. So as the British Empire went out, they started pulling from even more words, and dictionaries started standardizing things. And then we get all the way to Gen Z English today. So the English language, 1,500-year glow-up is top-tier lore, common linguistics, W, no cap. So who knows what that means, but like language evolves and changes, right? So here's all these different language families which evolved over time, and there's actually over 200 of them that we know of. So there's Indo-European, which is the one one of the biggest ones, Afro-Asiatic, like the Hebrew, Arabic. Japanese is interesting because it's one language and one language family. And linguists admit that there's no evidence that these 200 language families have a common origin. They speculate about it. They assume it's the case because of evolution, but they don't actually have evidence for that because they're not related, which matches very well with the Tower of Babel story. So that's good evidence for the Tower of Babel. And so we see here God's purposes with Babel, which Babel in Hebrew, it sounds like the Hebrew word for confusion. And God's doing a work in history. No one can stop him. Even the greatest men, the greatest achievements of men can't stop it. What we also see is that God has a heart for the nations and a diverse people group. So God formed the nations, and then we get to Abraham, and we see that God is actually going to use Abraham to do a work within the nations. So in Genesis 11, man's reaching towards God and greatness in his own way. And then in Genesis 12, we see that God actually breaks into history. It's kind of a contrast to the Tower of Babel. He initiates a relationship with an individual and chooses to bless him on his own. It's not this man achieving greatness on his own. And then the result of that, in all the families of the earth, which we just read about in chapter 10, they will be blessed. God is doing a work in history through the nation. So this comes down to our question from the beginning: what is true greatness? So it's not making a legacy for yourself, building up your own reputation. It's not achieving greatness, doing great things in the world's eyes, doing things that impress man. It's also not through man-made religion and achieving, saving yourself. And it's not something you could achieve on your own in your own independence. So how do you achieve true greatness? Well, so actually, unfortunately, you can't. So you will probably you'll never be great. And it's because it's not part of God's design. God didn't make you to be great. God made you to be an image to reflect his own greatness. And just reality, like we're learning from Ecclesiastes this in many ways. Like, don't expect to be impressive or noteworthy in the world. You may be able to impress people for a few seconds. Maybe a couple of people will say something you did once, but by and large, you're not, like, none of us in this room, including myself, is going to be impressive or noteworthy. And then in a generation of two, everybody is going to forget your name and not remember you. Let's say by chance, maybe you're somebody that does get mentioned in a history book. How many of you remember every name you read in your history books? Or do you read it and then immediately forget, right? So that's if you do happen to get in a history book, that's probably going to be your fate still. There's a rare exception. The only exception is, and then even if you are great in the world's eyes, like it's not great in God's eyes. The rare exception is if God chooses to make somebody great. So if Abraham, it says, I will make your name great. So God can do that for somebody for his glory. But again, that's a rare exception. So what you can do is merely become a reflection of God's greatness. And as his image, you can represent him well in your life. You can use all your capacities, all your opportunities to build up God's greatness. And that's something that is going to have an internal benefit. And a primary way of doing this, in the church especially, is through discipleship, is through creating and developing people that are more like Christ. That can be done one-on-one in a group setting. That can be done by starting a family. That's one of the best opportunities for discipleship, is to start a family, have kids, and disciple them. It can be done, like we support many missionaries that start churches, start seminaries, church planting. Like, God is doing a work in history, especially right now, through his church. So by spreading the gospel, by planting new churches, you are achieving what God wants to do in the world, or God's achieving what he wants to do through you. And people say this often: you're either sending or you're going. This is the Great Commission. There's just sitting idle isn't an option. You either have to be supporting God's work in history by going and doing it, or by supporting those who are going and doing it. And like Abraham, you can be a part of God's mission in his story, in history. God is accomplishing something, and especially today, he's building his people. And you can do that in your own way, with how you, whether it's in your family, through your friend group, through preparing yourself for something in the future. Everybody, it doesn't matter your occupation, what you want to do with your life. Like, you can do things to support God's mission in history. And so, unlike the Tower of Babel, they were seeking to be great on their own. Instead, we want to seek to build God's greatness through his church throughout history. So with that, we're a little bit over. We'll close in prayer. Heavenly Father, you are the only true great God. Your glory is in all the earth. We see it in creation. We see it in people who are your image, that you made to be like you. I pray for everyone here that they would see their identity as being image bearers, and that would shape how they live their life, that they wouldn't live for their own, but they would live to reflect who you are and show your true greatness. I pray that we wouldn't be motivated by pride, by building a legacy, by a reputation, by just good works that look good in front of others, but that we would be motivated by your glory, and that we would see your mission throughout history and have a desire to be a part of it. In Christ's name, amen. And there's your homework for next week.